Shawshank Redemption. I was listening to Morgan Freeman years later, and he said, it's a great movie. He said, but it's the craziest name because no one ever remembers how to pronounce it. I've seen it too many times, used it in class for illustrations. So if you haven't seen it, okay, this guy gets put into prison, and he talks about having hope. And there's this scene where he's talking to Morgan Freeman's character, and Morgan says, hope is really dangerous in prison. Okay? And you just think, well, this young guy has hope. Well, was it 20-some years later? Okay, he escapes from prison. But I was thinking, not just being in prison, but maybe you've been there yourself at times, or other people who've talked about, life is so bad, I don't have any hope. And so then we, as Christians, we come alongside and we say, no, you need to have hope in Jesus. And they say, you don't have a clue what I've been going through or what I'm currently going through. I know it seems like we're trying to encourage them. You need to have hope in Jesus. But when you're at the bottom, it's really hard to see, to have hope. So Zechariah 14, it's a story of hope. And it's a story to a new generation. Zechariah is probably writing this, I'm going to estimate, around maybe 40 years after the temple was rebuilt. The temple was built in 516 BC. This is maybe 480 BC, 475 BC. So I'm going to say 40 years. So there's a whole generation of Jews, 40 and under, who never lived in captivity. Okay, they were born in Jerusalem, and they've grown up either seeing the temple built or hearing stories about their grandparents building the story. So we're all old enough to say, you can raise your hand, I'll do parents, but grandparents. And if you have grandparents who canned food. Okay. Who canned food. Okay, maybe some of you still do. Okay, my grandmother did. And I remember thinking, just like say in the 70s, Grandma, we have grocery stores down the street. Okay, they had a garden in the backyard, they canned green beans, they had grapes. Why? And they were, of course, they were financially not wealthy, and sort of maybe lower middle class, but they saved everything. And of course, we're like, you'd throw something out. And I remember my grandma, saying, no, we saved that. Well, then reading her story that she wrote later, born in 1893, she lived through the Depression, lived through the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. She grew up on a farm. And so when they moved to the suburbs in the 50s, she continued to can food. And, we'd make jokes, oh, you must have grown up in the Depression, you save everything. But it happens with every generation. Then, for us, World War II. I remember reading about it in the books, but my father was there. You may have had grandparents or relatives at World War II. And, it's like, oh yeah, it was a bad war. Until you meet someone who really wants to talk about it. Well, a couple of days ago, I was watching part of this documentary on the Vietnam War. It's the same thing. I thought, oh, I remember growing up with it, and then realizing, okay, there's a whole host of people who weren't alive during the war, and we eat at a particular restaurant every 3 or 4 weeks with people who weren't alive during the Vietnam War. So you're trying to, so if you've experienced something, a traumatic experience, trying to explain it to somebody who hasn't been through it. Same thing when the movie came out with Corrie ten Boom, talking about the Holocaust. But she was there. And you can say, oh yeah, I read about it, yeah, but... So you have these Jews who, or during the time of Zechariah, who grew up in captivity. And most likely it may have been Haggai and Zechariah. They've experienced the horrors of captivity, and then just the challenge of coming back and the rebuilding the foundation, and then 16 years to rebuild the temple. You got this whole new generation. This is all they know. And so here in Zechariah, chapters 9 through 14, is this message some 40 years after the fact. And of trying to help them understand, okay, you built the temple, you've reestablished your festivals, your feasts, the nation of Israel. But why? Now, for those who've gone through captivity, thinking, because we know what life was like. For the generation who's never been through captivity in Babylon, thinking, okay, it's great, we have our own nation, but I'm trying to improvise. Things I used to say to my parents when I was younger. So what's the big deal about the temple? So we got our own country, but what's the big deal? And God sending Zechariah to say, this is why your parents and grandparents who rebuilt the temple, this is why rebuilding the temple is a big deal. And it's why it's a big deal for us. Okay? We were never in captivity in Babylon, but this is why it's so important of what God was doing, because he wasn't just establishing this new nation so this new generation could enjoy life without being in captivity, because he was pointing towards the coming of Jesus the first time in the flesh, the temple. Now, let's just assume what we know about the first coming of Jesus and all the facts and the details, the donkey, the 30 pieces of silver, born of a virgin, born in Bethlehem, going to go to Egypt. And I just think, for those of us who've been Christians a long time, we think, the evidence of the Old Testament is so obvious. Okay, it was not to the first century Jews. Even to the apostles, on the number of times they'd be like, what are you doing? Why are we doing this? That in a sense, we're in the same boat. Zechariah is talking about the second coming of Jesus, chapters 12 to 14, which you and I have never experienced. And so he's trying to explain it to us in chapter 14 and in the book of Revelation, but we don't know what it's like. So it's easy for us, but if we take ourselves where we're at now, back into the shoes of the Jews during the time of Zechariah, that they wouldn't have fully understood what he was talking about, the first coming of Jesus, let alone the second coming. And that is to say, to have a certain amount of humility when we talk about the second coming of Jesus and figuring it out. So here's the two perspectives to avoid. I'm going to get this out. I'm going to get this out front. I've talked about it before. One, I love reading the Bible and talking about Jesus. I just don't want to talk about the second coming and the millennial views and when he's coming. Okay? Or I want to talk about the second coming. I've already chosen my position, pre, post, or some other millennial view, and I'm going to die for that view. And I once applied at a college, Christian school, and one of the reasons I didn't get hired was because I wasn't as emphatic about being a premillennialist. Because I told them, I said, well, I'm still trying to figure this out. And they said, well, we're a premillennial school, so we can't hire you. There are churches that they're not going to hire you as a pastor if you're one, particularly if you're not premillennialist. Those are the two extremes. The question is that, well, what do we do? So if I said to you, read the Bible, but every time it talks about the first coming of Jesus, ignore it. You can't, because all the prophecies about the first coming of Jesus are interwoven throughout the Old Testament. And so if you said, well, I want to read the Bible, but I don't want to talk about the second coming, you can't do that either. So you say, well, I just won't read Revelation. Well, then you can't read 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And you can't read Matthew 24, 25, and 26. And you can't read passages that are in Peter. Because the second coming is woven, not just in the Old Testament, it's woven throughout the New Testament. So here's this dilemma. There's this event, first coming of Jesus in the flesh, second coming of Jesus when he comes out of the clouds. And that God wants us to know about these two events. They're interwoven in the Bible. And yet, when it comes to the second coming, we don't have it all figured out. So it's like we take one or two camps. So we're going to look at Zechariah 14 to try to wrestle with what are we going to do with this. So 6 things he's going to talk about when the Messiah comes. Because it started in chapter 12, chapter 13, and now chapter 14. And even though it's with chapter 12 and 14, there's sort of a distinction. So here we go. Behold, a day is coming. Okay? It's coming. For the Lord will spoil, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. So when the Jews left Babylon, right, the king, Cyrus, gave them all these resources to take with them back to Jerusalem. Now, Zechariah is saying, there will be a day in the future when all that stuff you took out of Babylon, which was yours anyway, is going to be taken from you again and divided. For I will gather all the nations. This is God. God's going to gather all the nations, non-Jewish nations, against Israel to battle. And you stop there and think, wait a minute. They already went into captivity. That was their punishment, 300 years that he sent the prophets. They spent their 70 years in captivity, came back, rebuilt the temple. And now, Zechariah, 40 years later, having just rebuilt the temple and reestablished the nation of Israel, now says to them, you're going to be attacked again. And now you're thinking, I thought we were done with being attacked. And he says, and the city shall be taken. Now, again, if you're the generation of Jews who lived in captivity, this is frightening. Maybe for this new generation going, hey, Grandpa, what are they talking about? Okay, the city will be taken, houses plundered, and women raped. And things haven't changed any. So you can turn on the news. Any number of conflicts taking place that are currently taking place in Europe and in fact in Israel back on October 7th. Okay? So, and then he says, half of the city will go into exile. Wait a minute, I thought there were promises that once they came out of captivity, God was going to reign with them forever. He says, but the rest of the people, the Jews, shall not be cut off from the city, so there seems to be a remnant. So here we are. This is around 480, 470 BC. So what are we talking? 2,500 years later, you and I get to sit in this nice room on a nice rainy day and figure this out. So what's he talking about? And thus come in, like at a basketball game or football game when the teams come in. Here's the premillennialist team, they come in. Here's the amillennial team, they come in. And so they're both going to tell you of what this means. So this is not all inclusive, but I have listed, for example, below, if you're going to read about Zechariah 9 or 12 through 14, you cannot read any scholar or commentary on Zechariah 14 without encountering the author's millennial view. So I read commentaries from premillennialists on Zechariah 14. That what they're saying is, he's describing when Jesus comes back and sets up his 1,000-year kingdom. And so I have quoted there from Revelation 16, when he talks about the Battle of Armageddon, that's what Zechariah is talking about. So that, just so you know, in book of Revelation, after the 7 churches, it starts in chapter 4 up until chapter 20 of Revelation. All of that symbolism is talking about the 7-year tribulation that will occur before Jesus comes back to set up his kingdom. So Jesus comes, raptures the Christians, they go to heaven, 7-year tribulation. There will be a great conversion of Jews. After 7 years, Jesus will come back. Now, there's differences in-house, but just so you know that Revelation 4 through 20, for premillennialists, basically is describing the 7-year tribulation. For the amillennialist, who says that the millennium period is the church, so we're in the millennium period. We've been in this period for 2,000 years. Revelation 4 through 20 is not describing a specific 7-year period. He's just describing life around the church in every generation. So when you go through Revelation, when it's talking about the symbolism, they can go back and say, well, in this period of history, the church experienced this, 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 and this. So it's not a specific, it's sort of a broad picture. So the amillennial view, 2 Peter, when he talks about, in the second letter I'm writing to you, beloved, in whom, and both of them I am stirring up your sincere mind by way of the reminder that you should remember the predictions of the holy prophets, okay, including Zechariah, and the commandment of the Lord and Savior, that's Matthew 24, 25, 26, and through your apostles, 2 Thessalonians 2, knowing, first of all, that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own sinful desires. They will say, where's the promise of his coming? And so the amillennialist says, what Zechariah is talking about is, during the church age, there will be times of tribulation, and because we Christians are now the new Israel, so that when Christians, particularly groups of Christians, are suffering, and we read, particularly even recently in Africa, where X number of Christians were taken out of a church. It was someplace in Africa, and they were killed. The amillennialists will say that's what Zechariah is talking about. That every generation of the church for 2,000 years has had periods of persecution of people fighting Jerusalem, meaning the church. Okay? So, you get the two sides, you get your two commentaries. This is what they do. And I'm reading them going, okay? And then the irony is they all have their evidence. So if you're talking to a premillennialist, and they like to refer to Revelation, of course, but they like to refer to the Old Testament. And say, see what Isaiah said, Jeremiah, etc. The amillennialists, who will use Revelation and the prophets, they love the New Testament. But they will cross over. So a premillennialist can go to the New Testament, and 2 Thessalonians is one of them, and he talks about the man of lawlessness. Okay? And everybody says, what's he talking about? And the premillennialist says, see, he's introducing the period of the tribulation. The amillennialist says, no, he's just talking about that there has been periods of church history where there has been enemies, and maybe there will be a rise in persecution before Jesus comes back. And so they're crisscrossing. So on the one hand, if you want to pull your hair out, if you have any left, is you read the two of them. And I said, my personal problem is if you're diehard on one position, meaning you're diehard because you've avoided the other side, that's a problem. But when you read both sides, at least in my experience, it's like, I'm more confused now than I ever was. So, it still leaves us with, what are we going to do? So, what I'm going to do this evening is, I have examples of and amillennial position for each of these points in Zechariah 14. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each of them. But I'm just telling you, they're ready. Oh, by the way, I will mention this. When it talks about, city will be taken, houses plundered, women raped, there are those who've already said, you see, premillennialists, some premillennialists will say, that's what happened on October 7th, when Hamas attacked Israel and took captives and raped some of them and killed some of them. So the premillennialist is very keen to watching the news since Israel came back in 1948. The amillennialist just says, yes, it's horrific what Hamas did, but that's happened in every church age. Okay, so this is confusing as to what do you mean Jerusalem's going to be attacked again? Okay, and by the way, what he's describing, it's in the future. So it's beyond the coming of Jesus in the flesh. So sometime in the future, this is going to happen. So the second one is chapter 14, verse 3. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights a day of battle. So it's like, okay, enemies will come in, according to Zechariah, attack Jerusalem. There'll be this great conflict. But then the Lord will go out. And what is interesting here again is, even from Zechariah, regardless of your position, it said, if God is speaking, I will gather all the nations. And then the Lord will go out. So God's involved in world history. So the Lord's going to go out and fight against those nations. And then he describes it. And on this day, his feet, the Lord, the Messiah, will stand on the Mount of Olives, just east of Jerusalem. That lies between Jerusalem on the east, and Mount Olives shall be. Then he says, and Mount Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, sort of like an earthquake, so that one half of the mount will move northward, and the other half will move southward. And you shall flee to the valley of my mountains, for the valleys of the mountains shall reach to Uzal. Don't worry about that. And you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, which is briefly mentioned in Amos. Then the Lord, my God, will come, and all the holy ones with him. So Zechariah is talking about literal description in terms of there really is a Mount of Olives. So this is it. Here's Jerusalem, and the temple is at around 2,400 feet above sea level. So it's up on a mount, the temple. The Mount of Olives is east, and it's 300 feet higher. It's just over 2,700 feet. So if you're at the Mount of Olives, you can look down on the temple. Yeah.
I know, I'm just.
No, so you can look down.
I'm doing my
Okay? And there's lots of things in the New Testament that happen on the Mount of Olives. So what he says is going to happen is the Lord's going to come back, fight the enemies that fought Jerusalem, and then he's going to be on the Mount of Olives. And then what the Lord's going to do, we think, he's going to split it open. And what he's doing is he's going to make this canyon between the Mount of Olives and the city of Jerusalem. Okay, there's going to be this similar to the parting of the Red Sea. And the reason is because that's how God's going to rescue the Jews who are in Jerusalem when they're being attacked. So he's going to come on the Mount of Olives to reminisce to the Jews. There's going to be a parting, this time of the land. And then the people in Jerusalem will flee through this canyon. And then after they flee and get out of Jerusalem and are saved, he then says, then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. Now, if you think for a moment that Zechariah is going to help you understand your millennial view, you would be incorrect. Obviously, because it occurred. You know, the millennial view only occurs in Revelation 20. It's the only place in the Bible. So obviously it occurred later. So now you're going, okay, battle in Jerusalem, then God's going to intervene, going to come back on the Mount of Olives, split it, the Jews are going to escape, and then the Lord's going to come with all of his angels. Okay? Now, you're sitting here thinking, yeah, but Doug, is it literal or is it figurative? Okay? So, the premillennialists have Daniel chapter 2. Okay, I'm not going to read that, but they got the passage. This is literal. The amillennialists point to the number of places that the Mount of Olives is talked about in the New Testament. And I'll talk after the first two. For example, Jesus prepares to come in Jerusalem on a donkey, starting in Bethany, which is near the Mount of Olives. Jesus predicts the apostles will scatter while he is on the Mount of Olives. Jesus is on the Mount of Olives in the Garden of Gethsemane when he prays the prayer, not my will be done, but your will be done. Jesus is on the Mount of Olives when he teaches the apostles about the second coming. And that's interesting because in Matthew 24, when it switches and he starts talking about the second coming, it says Jesus left Jerusalem and he went up to the Mount of Olives. Here's Zechariah saying, Lord's going to come back, Mount of Olives. Okay? Jesus ascends into heaven on the Mount of Olives. Acts 1. And then, remember when he leaves? The angel says, he's coming back the same way. Implied, well, he's coming back to the Mount of Olives. So, if I think Jesus is coming tomorrow, then I'm flying to Israel and I'm going to book a hotel in Bethany because that's where he's coming. Okay? Now, again, premillennialists, this is literal. Amillennialists, no, it has spiritual significance because we're involved in spiritual warfare, etc., etc. Okay, chapter 14, verse 6. These will be the signs that will precede the coming of this Messiah when he comes back. And now you're going, good. We got 6 signs. So chapter 14, verse 6. On that day there shall be no light, cold, or frost. And you're thinking, well, there's no light when it's raining, but there's still cold. Okay, but he says, there shall be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening there will be light. Thus, it's unique. There's no light when the Messiah comes, and yet there will be light. Okay? 2, that's the first sign. You can just go outside. Oh, the sun's shining today. I guess he's not coming back. 2, on that day, living water shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the east sea, that's the Dead Sea, and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter. So if you're a literalist, you think this is literally going to happen. Well, it's quite a ways from Jerusalem to the Mediterranean. But, okay, so that's the second sign. Third sign, universal worship. And the Lord will be king over all the earth. And on that day the Lord will be one, and his name one. Okay? And some refer to the prayer, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. So the premillennial says, even in the Lord's Prayer, it talks about that Jesus is going to come, set up his kingdom. The amillennialist says, no, he set up his kingdom when he sent the Holy Spirit. The fourth one is what I call the exaltation of Jerusalem. The whole land shall be turned into a plain from Jeba, which is north of Jerusalem, to Rimmon, which is southwest of Jerusalem. Okay? So if Jerusalem's on this mount, and the temple is on this mount at 2,400 feet, he says everything around Jerusalem is going to be flattened. Western Kansas, eastern Colorado, before you get to the mountain, okay? I always laugh when people think that Iowa is flat. No, you need to go to western Kansas. Okay, it's going to be flat. And that's because Jerusalem is going to be, it says, but Jerusalem shall remain aloft. So Jerusalem's going to remain at its height, okay, in this site. And then he says, to the site from the gate of Benjamin, that's in the north, to the place of the former gate, to the corner gate, that's in the west. One's in northeast, corner gate is northwest, and from the Tower of Handel to the King's winepress, that's in the south. In other words, all of the city of Jerusalem is going to stay on the hill, and everything around it's going to be flat. And that's a sign that the Messiah is coming. So again, for the okay, this has to literally happen. For the amillennialists, it's figurative language as to what's going to happen. The next one, absence of a curse, and it shall be inhabited. So Jerusalem's going to still have people in it, remember? Because they went through the valley of the earthquake, whatever. Now they're rescued. For there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction, and Jerusalem will not be destroyed again. And by the way, when it says that there's going to be a plain, the significance of that for Jerusalem is they have an enormous military advantage now. Because now they're on the top, and if everything around them is flat, they can see their enemies. That's part of the imagery of what's happening. So they're not going to be destroyed again, Jerusalem. And then he says, and Jerusalem shall dwell in security, and they'll be protected. Okay? Now, I am going to laugh at what I'm going to share with you now. The premillennialist interprets each of those 6 signs. And so I give you examples. And they're from Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. The amillennialist also interprets the 6 signs. But they interpret them more in terms of, Jesus said, I'm the living water. Jesus said, now through the Holy Spirit we'll worship as one. Jesus was exalted. That's Jerusalem. Galatians talks about Christ redeemed us from a curse on the cross. And then Romans 8, we're more than conquerors. So if you're new or relatively new to how these two views understand the second coming, you see what they're doing. So the premillennialist takes those passages, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, and says, they are literally going to happen. And that's what Zechariah is describing. The amillennialist says, nah, it's happening in every church age. So, again, as we proceed from Zechariah, you're saying to yourself, I know, but when are we going to fully understand what Zechariah is telling us? So, maybe the next one, chapter 14, verse 12. And this shall be the plague which the Lord will strike all the people that wage war against Israel. So the Jews are going to be rescued through this cavern. Okay, they're going to be protected. There's going to be these signs. But remember the water that's running through Jerusalem. That's because Jerusalem will have the water. The implication is the enemies out in the plains will not. And then there'll be this plague. So this plague will come on all the people who wage war against Jerusalem. And listen to this. If you're like a middle school boy, this is a great description. You read this to a middle school, Sunday school class of boys. Their flesh will rot while they are standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths.
The Last Crusade.
What?
The Last Crusade.
Well,
Indiana Jones.
well. Okay, so here we go. Now you're thinking, so what are each of these camps? Okay, how are they going to describe this? Next one. And on that day, a great panic from the Lord shall fall on them. Well, of course there is.
so that each will seize the hand of another, and the hand of the one will be raised against the hand of the other, and even Judah will fight at Jerusalem. And they'll be so full of panic because people are rotting that they will start fighting among themselves, the enemies. But then he says, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations, okay, shall be collected, gold, silver, and garments in great abundance, and returned to the Jews. So all the enemies of Jerusalem are going to be rotten away, and the wealth that these nations have is going to end up fighting its way back to Jerusalem. But then he says, and he goes back to the plague. And a plague like this plague shall fall on the horses, the mules, the camels, the donkeys, and whatever beasts may be in those camps. And why I've learned to appreciate literature, but literature in the Bible is, that is a way of saying it's going to be so bad that these people who are rotting, so I'm watching you rot away, and then I'm watching you rot away, and I'm thinking, well, I sure don't want to hang around to rot away, so I'm going to go get on my horse to get out of town, and my horse will be rotting away. Okay? My mule will rot away, my camels will rot away, my donkeys will rot away. There will not be a single beast that will not be rotting away. They cannot get out of town. Okay? And again, premillennialists, Revelation 15, about the plagues. Amillennialists, for example, Ananias and Sapphira. They drop dead. That's I thought, rotting while you're standing. Ananias and Sapphira drop dead, and then it says, and great fear came upon them. So the amillennial says, see, this is not literal in a sense of Jesus coming back and reign, the 7-year tribulation and reigning in Israel for 1,000 years, but it happened during the church era, Herod rotting away, and even what Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians. Okay, we progress. Chapter 14, verse 16. Then, everyone who survives of all the nations. So think about this. So all these nations are attacking Israel, but it's flat, so Israel has an advantage. Okay, they're rotting away, and they can't even get out of town. But there will be some of them who survive the plague. Okay? Those people who survives of all the nations that have come against Israel shall go up year after year to worship the king. And you think, well, no wonder you're going to worship the king, because you just watched the king wipe out, right? Nearly everyone. So this is like the retreat. Okay, we lose, we retreat, but there's difference in war. I was watching some World War II, both sides, okay? And I never understood this completely. You know, if you're fighting people, you kill them. And then, you know, if you retreat, you're not supposed to kill people who have surrendered. And I don't know, part of me just says it's war. But anyway. But when you surrender, either side, World War II, you don't then automatically, you don't surrender to the Americans if you're German and then immediately say, I want to, sign up to be an American. I want to be an American citizen. Or I want to go to Berlin and be a German citizen. These enemies that are left, they're going to go to Jerusalem and begin to worship. And I think that makes sense, because this God of the Jews must be all-powerful. So they worship the King of Hosts, and they will keep the Feast of Booths, which is the Feast of Tabernacles. That was in the fall. It's to celebrate the final fall harvest. Okay? So these enemies of the Jews, whoever's left, they're actually going to, in a sense, practice Jewish worship. Again, the amillennialists have a view. Well, let me go on. What if you decide not to? And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem, okay, you survived the rotting away, but you're saying, I am not going up there. So if you choose not to, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them, which might be nice for today. And if the family of Egypt does not go up and present themselves, then on them there will be no rain. There shall be the plague with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. And you can say, well, okay, they're going to go up and worship, but are they really worshiping from the heart? Or they're saying, look, what's my alternative? If I don't go up, I'm going to be wiped out by the plague anyway. And when he says there's going to be no rain, I mean, rain is the source of life. So these are agricultural people. So they're going to go, and this isn't like you're going to go around and interview these non-Jewish nations and take a poll. Hey, you want to come up and worship with us? It's like, no, you're coming or God's going to take you out. Okay? Premillennialists. Micah 4, 1 through 5. And by the way, the amillennialists use that same passage, by the way, to refer to the church. Just want to let you know. It's almost like you need a Bible that says, the premillennials say, these are our passages. Stay away. Okay, next page. Also from Ezekiel 43. Now, what's the church going to do with this? Well, Acts 2. Initially they were Jews, but where were they? They were from everywhere around the Roman Empire. This is the idea of all the nations. But then Acts 14, at the end of the first missionary journey, Paul goes in and tells the church in Jerusalem what? You won't believe what the non-Jewish nation, Gentile people are doing. They're becoming Christians. And the church says, see, I'm millennials. See, Ezekiel's right. He's just talking about the Gentiles who have become Christians, us. And Acts 21, end of the third missionary journey, Paul comes back and he says, look at all the thing that God has done among the Gentiles. That's all Zechariah is talking about. Okay? Chapter 14, verse 20. And on that day, there shall be inscribed on the bells of the horses, holy to the Lord. So, you know, if you live on a farm and you have horses and you have pigs, you need those animals. But you don't bring those animals into your house. Okay, you have a barn. So he's talking about these animals, and they're important, but they're not like how some people treat their dogs and their cats. Okay. They're out here. But he said, there will come a day when the Messiah comes that there will be signs on all of your animals that says, holy to the Lord. In other words, God is going to make things that don't seem to be holy, he's going to make them holy. He's going to eliminate that which is unholy. And he uses this great illustration. Then he says, and all the pots in your house of the Lord shall be as the bowls before the altar. So you go home, open your kitchen drawer, and you got all these pots and pans. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one of those pots or bowls, and then, and so I'm trying to imagine this, and you go to any church that does the Lord's Supper, but maybe does the Lord's Supper not every week, and they have it up front, and maybe they have, you know, a bowl up there. You're going to just take some Tupperware bowl in your kitchen, and you're going to bring it into a church sanctuary and say, you know what? When we pass around the cup, we're not going to, you know, buy a nice fancy cup. If you've been to a church where they dip it into the cup, you go up and you dip your bread into a cup and you dip it into a Tupperware bowl. You're like, that's the best you could come up with, okay? So what he's saying is God's going to take those things which are common in your house, these pots. He's going to make them holy. He's going to set them apart for his purposes. And then he says, and every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holy to the Lord of hosts, so that all who sacrifice may come and take of them and boil the meat of the sacrifice in them. He's going to come and take your garbage can. When he says all of the other pots, these are the pots that aren't even in your house. So he's going to take your garbage can, and then he's going to bring it, again in our analogy, and bring it to some holy church service. And so maybe you're attending a wedding, and the husband and wife are going to share communion, and again, they're maybe using an old rusted soup can that has the wine in it to serve each other. And you're sitting there going, they couldn't find a nice glass to serve communion with. So this is why this story is so great, because it helps you really try to picture it. So when the Messiah comes, he's going to take that which is unholy and he's going to make it holy. Well, how's he going to do that? Well, he's going to get rid of that which is unholy. So, premillennialists, they got Revelation 4, holy, holy, holy is the Lord. You got Revelation 11. The amillennialist turns to Romans 12, your spiritual worship, present yourselves to God right? This is your holy and acceptable worship. Paul in 1 Corinthians, the Holy Spirit lives in you. You are now the temple. So we finish Zechariah 14, and then we say, okay, so I don't carry money with me anymore, but if I did, so this is what we do. We just get a quarter, and we'll go flip it. And we're going to go around the room, and you say, heads is premillennialist, post is, or amillennialist is tails, and you're just going to go around the room, you flip the coin, and whichever it lands on, that's what you now believe. Okay? And then we'll all go, we'll go home. There are those, and I have been in this camp. Like, I'm tired of, fighting over this stuff is stupid. So I don't care, don't care. Or, okay, I got it all figured out, and so I got a 15 series that I'll sell to you for $29.95 that will explain to you which view it is. Okay. Zechariah doesn't explain it to us. He just says, this is what's going to happen. So the first view, if you say, I don't want this debate, then you have to take Zechariah 12 through 14, if you have a real Bible, and just rip it out of your Bible. And rip out everything in the Old and New Testament that has anything to do with the second coming. And then all the songs we sing, any song about the second coming, with the last verse of Amazing Grace, right? Take it out. We can't sing them. You can't. You can't say, I'm a Christian, I believe in Jesus, he came in the flesh, but I just don't want to talk about, be taught, read, study, anything about the second coming. You cannot. It's inseparable as it is the first coming. But the other side is to say, yeah, but I know exactly when this is going to happen. So when Israel became a country in 1948, that's a new point. You can't. And thus leaves us with this dilemma. It seems like a dilemma, doesn't it? What in the world are we supposed to do? And I told you, when I was decided to do the Old Prophets, I thought, a year ago, I thought, that's okay, I got a whole year to figure out Zechariah. Well, here it is. It has now arrived on April 5th, 2025. And there's since been a terror as a teacher. One thing, those of us who teach, that terrifies us is to show up into a class and not have a clue what we're going to teach, right? Or that a student's going to ask you a question and you're not going to know the answer. And when I first started teaching English, and I wasn't as well versed in grammar then as I am now, that's what terrified me. Don't ask me, 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 okay? Because I remember in language school, we were studying subjunctive in Spanish. And we were all going, hey, what's subjunctive mean in Spanish? So then somebody said, well, what is subjunctive in English? Now, most of these people have Masters of Divinity degrees or Doctorate of Divinity degrees. And I remember a couple of them going, I don't know what subjunctive is in English, so how in the world do I know what it is in Spanish? So I thought, so what are we going to do with Zechariah 14? So, this is what I'm going to do with Zechariah 14. So I've sort of, I won't say tricked you, but the purpose of the handout in putting the premillennial view and the amillennial view was not to help clarify one view or another. That wasn't my intent at all. I just put it there to show you, in case you're not aware, that that's what's going on. But looking at both sides, we're not going to explain this to you. It's not going to okay, I got it. But I went back again, I just go back, okay, so the audience of Zechariah at the time that they heard this, in 480, 450 BC, okay, what are they processing? What we're going to assume is, yes, there's a hope that Jesus, this Messiah, anointed one, is going to come back. That was 9 through 11. And that after that, he's going to come again. Okay? But we know that even when Jesus came in the first century, the Jews didn't understand it. So, we'll read. It's in Mark. Jesus said, He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. You think, well, it's in Isaiah. Read Isaiah 52 and 53. Okay, read Psalm 22. And you think, and Peter says, Jesus said this plainly. Peter took him aside and rebuked him. So this is what I want to say. Instead of us looking at Peter and the others throughout Bible history and saying, you know, those guys really were blind and they really were immature and ignorant. What Peter's misunderstanding of Jesus' mission is for us. We are at times as blind and as stupid as Peter was. We can't say, well, Peter's over here. I can't believe he rebuked Jesus of going to the cross. How could he do that? It's because it's what we do. So on the one hand, you and I have to embrace, we are limited, even with the Bible, the Holy Spirit, of what we can understand, particularly about the second coming. We have to embrace our ignorance and a humbleness that said, I don't know. And I know people on either side, some of them, that's the last thing they want to say publicly is, well, I don't really know about the millennial view, because that's why they've dug in there. And then this guy over here says, yeah, I'm a pan-millennialist, you know, it'll all pan out. They're both doing the same thing. And I think the view is to say, I don't know. But I do know. What I don't know are the details, and I don't know when. So I don't know how all the symbolism of Zechariah and Revelation are going to pan out. I do not know. And I still don't know, will there be a 7-year tribulation? Don't know. Will there be a rapture? Don't know. Will Jesus come back and reign in 4,000 years? Don't know. Will he just come back and take his church home? I don't know. Don't know. This is so liberating, guys. We need like a support group for people who are recovering from studying millennial views all their life. Okay? I don't know. Because Zechariah is not about the millennial view. Okay? It can't be, historically, because it's way in the future. And they both have their views, and they go back and forth. So, what I want us to do is put ourselves in the sandals of the Jews during the time of Zechariah. Why would God give the Jews in 480 BC and all of the other prophets, why would he give the nation of Israel, on the one hand, prophecies about Jesus coming for the first time, if he also knew that they wouldn't understand them all, particularly the Jewish religious leaders would not understand them? And as a teacher, you think that's a terrible teacher. I'm going to give you a lesson knowing that you won't understand it. So God just needs to explain it to us. So yes, at the time of Jesus, look, they didn't understand the virgin birth, of him going to Egypt and all the things that happened, and particularly that he would die on a cross. Particularly when they arrest him, as we will, next week, Palm Sunday, and all the apostles left. They left. And you know what they said when they left? Judas betrays him, Peter denies him, and they all scatter. They were saying to Jesus, like, we don't believe you saying about this resurrection. The apostles didn't believe it, guys. And as we know, when he did raise from the dead, he appears to Mary Magdalene. He appears to his women. He has to send Mary initially to the apostles, and they don't even initially believe him. So if you're saying, man, I don't really understand these millennial views, man, you and I are in good company. Okay? And yet, there were people in the first century who believed in Jesus' first coming. Mary, the mother of Jesus. You're going to have a child. Well, I'm a virgin. How can that be? So the angel explains it, and then Mary basically says, okay. Mary believed the first coming of Jesus without having to have the angel lay out a chart. If you've ever seen these millennial charts online, Some of them are like 80 miles long, right? And they have of all the stuff that's going to happen. Mary doesn't require that. The Roman centurion who goes to Jesus and says, hey, I have this servant and he's dying and I need you to come. And Jesus says, well, I will come. And he says, no, you don't need to come because I understand authority. Just speak it now. And Jesus says, I have not found faith like that in all of Israel. A Roman soldier believed in the first coming of Jesus without having the whole chart of when he's coming. And when you go through the scriptures and you find people, the Samaritan woman, she didn't have a seminary degree. How in the world could she embrace who this Jesus was? And that's why in John 4, then you have Nicodemus. That's why he has to come at night. He's struggling. And I'm going to throw something out here. I think one of the hazards that all of us have, the longer we're Christians and the longer we know the Bible of it, the irony of it is making it at times more difficult for us to believe in his second coming. Because we become either I don't need to or I know exactly when he's coming and thus miss the point. And that there are Christians who don't have a tenth of the Bible knowledge that you and I have. But, man, he's coming back. And they're living their life. What that means is they're living their life now with the certainty that he's coming back. So we are like the Jews were. We're talking about a future event with which we don't know. We do know, but we don't know. And what that means is, the admonition in the New Testament is, he's coming back. What does that mean? Romans, you need to wake up, okay? You need to be prepared. The parable of the 10 virgins, you got to be ready. That's what it means for us. So if we believe that Jesus is truly coming back, then today and tomorrow, the next week, we live our Christian life under that belief. He's coming back. I don't understand exactly when, but he's coming back, and therefore it has to change my life. And the way to sort of determine what you believe about the second coming is how does it affect your life today, tomorrow, next week, and next month? Instead of just saying, oh, he's coming back someday, so I'll just live my life the way I want. But no, he's coming, He's coming. We had a professor, Norfolk Staten, crazy guy. And he's in the middle of class. I was in the class. He was in a class. And in the middle of class, he goes, oh, no, my in-laws are coming to visit today. And then he keeps talking. And then 10 minutes later, he goes, oh, no, my wife's not home, and the house is a mess. And he keeps teaching. And he says, oh, no, they're coming. And he just leaves. And a student, fortunately, taped it. That spread throughout campus. Norfolk Staten left in the middle of class. I have a 4-year degree from that college. This is one of the few things I remember. He's teaching about what the second coming does. If he's coming, you get ready now. Not tomorrow. He's coming. If the tornado's coming, I got like 4 hours. No, you don't. It's like right out your window. That's what this is all about. And we can get so into the weeds that we forget it. So, what I didn't do is, if you'll take one and pass it around. This is page 5 and 6. I didn't want to attach it because it would be too long. So, this is your homework. And as I've been taught, teaching and giving the students homework and now teaching my daughter or granddaughter, this is the homework. Zechariah 14, and let the scriptures speak for themselves, have, I think, uncanny parallels to Revelation 20, verse 7 to the end. So Revelation 27 is after the millennial period. So in Revelation talks about there'll be this 1,000-year period. Okay, we don't know what he's talking about, but it says in Revelation, after the millennial period, verse 7, Satan will be released. He'll go out. There's this big battle, Gog and Magog, okay, which then introduces Jesus is going to come on his throne. And then Revelation 21 and 22, there will be a new heaven and a new earth. So look at the first page. On the left is Zechariah. Behold, a day is coming. Revelation says, oh, for the time is near. Zechariah says, I will gather all the nations against Israel, Jerusalem to battle, And he says, and when the 1,000 years are over, Satan will be released from his prison. He will come out and deceive the nations, and there will be this great battle. The next one says, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. But he says in Revelation, okay, nothing unclean will ever enter it, nor anyone who does what is detestable, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. If your name's not in the book, in a sense, for Zechariah, you're destroyed. Your name's in the Lamb's book of life, you will be saved. As Zechariah says, some of them were not cut off. Next one, the Lord will go out and fight against those nations. Revelation says, oh, and I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. He then says, Zechariah, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. Revelation says, he carried me away in the spirit in a great high mountain and showed me the holy city of Jerusalem coming down out of heaven. The next one talks about will flee through the mountains, and then in boldface it says, then the Lord my God will come and all the holy ones with him. I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you about these things for the churches. And we know from in Corinthians that when Jesus returns, he'll come with his angels. Zechariah says, on that day there will be no light. He says, the new heavens and new earth. The city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it. But then Zechariah says, oh, but it's a unique day, but at evening there will be light. And then Revelation says, oh, but for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. There's no light in heaven, and yet there is a light because God is the light. Zechariah says, there'll be living waters. Revelation mentions that 3 times, the new heavens and new earth. Zechariah talks about the Lord will be king over all the earth. And Revelation says, the one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. The next one says, Jerusalem will remain aloft. Remember, it will remain elevated. Again, he says, he carried me away, and he saw Jerusalem high up on a mountain. He then says at the bottom, it shall be inhabited, and there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem will dwell in security. I saw a new heaven and new earth. Okay? And this new heaven and new earth are not going to pass away. And then Zechariah talks about a plague. Read Revelation. Then came one of the 7 angels who had these 7 bowls full of the 7 plagues. Zechariah talked about, and there will be a great panic. Okay? Because people are going to be killed. Revelation says, as Jesus comes for his church, he then says, but outside of God's kingdom, if you will, are the dogs and the sorcerers and the sexually immoral and the murderers and the idolaters and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. Panic because they're not getting into the new heaven and new earth. Then he says, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be collected, gold, silver, and garments. Why in the world does, in Revelation, it's in last part 21, 22, describe in detail the wealth of the temple in heaven. Every kind of jewel, city with gold. He then talks about everyone who survives of all the nations. They will come up and worship the king. Revelation says, by its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. Jew, Gentile will all come. He says, and to keep the Feast of Booths, tabernacle. And Revelation says, behold, the dwelling place. Tabernacle means dwelling. God's going to come and tabernacle with us in the new heaven, new earth. He then says, look, there's a punishment to all the nations who do not go up to worship God. Revelation says, but as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is in the second death. Zechariah talks about holy is to the Lord, and it begins with, I saw the holy city, and then Zechariah ends with, there shall be no longer a traitor in the house. In other words, someone who will go against God. And he says, behold, I'm coming soon, bringing my recompense with me to repay each one for what he has done. In literature, I just look for patterns. That's all I do. And I look at this pattern and say, this is a coincidence that these two match? And I haven't even covered it all, so that's the homework. To really go back, take Zechariah 14, take the last part of Revelation and just go through them. So Zechariah is describing the new heavens and new earth, which I want to say that he is. This isn't a battle over amillennial or premillennialism. It's a battle, he's coming. I don't know exactly when, and I don't know how. But whether he sets up an earthly kingdom of 1,000 years or not, it doesn't change for a second of how you and I are to live our lives tomorrow. Well, I don't believe that he's going to come back for 1,000 years. I'm an amillennialist. So therefore, I can go rob a bank. The absurdity to say that one of these views drives, it doesn't. I think also, again, just try to figure where I'm coming from. This, when he talked about there will be no light, but then he says it will be a unique day, there's this tension. It doesn't take you long to study the Bible, and you guys know this. You start reading the Bible, and what happens is you realize, this story isn't exactly laid out perfectly. And you and I live with this tension. We don't understand. This passage is this, but then this passage is this. Doesn't the Bible contradict itself? We live with that. And non-Christians say, that's a reason not to believe it. I will say to you, that's an exact reason to believe in it, because you're talking about a holy, perfect God who's trying to explain to us infant or finite humans. And so you try to explain to a 5-year-old global warming, good luck. Or what DNA is, good luck. So what do is we come up with these simple illustrations for the 4, 5, 6-year-old, but they're not perfect. And what God's doing is he loves us so much that he came in the flesh and dwelt among us, rose again, ascended to heaven, which we celebrate in the next 2 weeks, but he's coming again. So what he's done is he's given us these stories. Not because we'll understand all the details, but to say, no, he's coming, he's coming, he's coming, he's coming. And as sure as he came the first time, he's coming a second time. And it's what you and I are going to do. Father, thank you. Oh, man. It says, Father, thank you for what seems to be confusion in the Bible, but I don't think it is. I just think that, Father, you're such a loving God that you came. And you came in humility on a donkey and died on a cross that we will remember during Palm Sunday. But then you rose again. But Father, you're going to come again, this time on a white horse, to separate the sheep and the goats. And the time of salvation is today, not when you come back. And so, Father, it presses upon all of us in our own lives and sharing this gospel with others that today is the day of salvation. Today is the day for people to find you and discover you. But it's not an open-ended time. And so for those that are part of the sheep, it will be great rejoicing to enter into this new heaven and new earth. But for those that are the goats, it will be beyond any type of terror that they can think of. And so, Father, in that sense, all Christians live with that constant tension between heaven and hell. Thank you, Father. In Jesus' name, amen.
As we